The storyteller, or the artist, has many decisions they must make when creating something. Now, I'm not going to sit here like an English teacher and pretend a random offhand remark in a book is the meaning of life. I've had to bullshit my way through too many English tests because somehow the color of a bird in a forest is important. I think the author simply thought, yeah, a goose should be gray because geese are gray in this part of the country, not this specific goose should be gray because it represents a metaphysical conceit between the different realms in the Christian afterlife. With that said, certain details do matter in giving depth to a story, but this is not without the broader implications of, well, more significant decisions. Why does Kurt Vonnegut write Slaughterhouse-Five with such disregard to linear storytelling? For those who are not aware, Slaughterhouse-Five skips back and forth between the Dresden bombings and World War II, the then-present day of the 1960s, a future of humanity different to our current reality, and some aliens. This is confusing, but I think this is important because Kurt Vonnegut wrote a non-linear story in a very linear format. We still experience the slow release of information in the story by it being a narrative, as a normal reader isn't going from page 1 to 10, then reading pages 25 through 30, then finally returning back to page 2. So while Billy Pilgrim experiences time differently to the rest of humanity, the effect that Vonnegut creates is by telling several stories at the same time, revealing equally as important information that ultimately still gives a pretty complete picture of the whole book. The reason I bring this up is to answer why an artist made the decision to put their art in the format of a book. Sure, in the 1960s, video games simply were not in the public conscious, so a Slaughterhouse-Five video game was never going to be created. But the conscious decision by Kurt Vonnegut to write a book as opposed to a film is because the story can be told in words. In fact, the content of Vonnegut's own narration is important to conveying the story as a whole, but also because Kurt Vonnegut is not a filmmaker, he's an author. So what does this have to do with Gris? Pretty colors. No, so here's something to think about. If you watch footage of a game and there is no UI, does that not just become a movie? I mean, the main difference between Doom and Doom is that one has the rock and isn't interactive. So in a way, gameplay footage without the UI ends up looking more cinematic. Unless your name is Half-Life, cutscenes tend to reduce the UI elements so that the player can focus on these key moments of the story. From long cutscenes to the automated ones you get when you approach a character in Fallout, sometimes it's a good idea to dim or completely remove the ammo and health bars. Gris is a 2D walking simulator, yet it has a certain cinematic quality to it that makes it unique to play. There isn't a lot of input in this game, as while you do end up with several power-ups by the end of the game, you do start off with only the ability to walk. There are several sections in this game where you simply move forward. You slide down a long sandy slope before getting to the next section. There are huge objects that move from one place to another as you follow them. Moments like this make you feel small, as if you're a tiny thing among this incredible scenery. Gris is one hell of a beautiful game, but I need to now ask, why would you make something like this a game? The reason I talk so long about UI elements being on display is that this game doesn't really have any. If you don't know anything about this game and I told you you were watching an experimental art project, would you believe me? If I just took screen caps from the game and said these were a part of an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, would you believe me? I mean, Salvador Dali, he made a lot of different works in different mediums, with there being a reason for each, even if the main style remained surreal throughout it all. Each medium has its own strengths and limitations. For instance, a picture cannot play a guitar, so why would you specifically make a game with so few gameplay elements when you could tell the story in any other medium, like an animation, or just by putting images of the game in a gallery? To answer this, let me tell you the story of a man named Stanley. These are the first few lines the narrator in the Stanley Parable says, because in this game, you follow what the narrator says. You are told who Stanley is, where he works, and what weird thing has happened in his workspace.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
Yet following such a narrative doesn't really lead anywhere. Kevin Brighting does an awesome job as the narrator in the game.
Yes, this room. What a beautiful room.
Yet, in the true ending of the Stanley Parable, there just isn't really anything to feel in the game.
Perhaps his goal had not been to understand, but to let go. No longer would anyone tell him where to go.
Now, if you disobey the narrator,
but in his eagerness to prove that he is in control of the story and no one gets to tell him what to do, Stanley leapt from the platform and plunged to his death.
you get a different result. You may do so out of spite, and once you've done it once, you may feel inclined to do it again and again.
Stanley walked through the red. All right, fine, go ahead.
This is the interactivity you have with the game, as depending on how disobedient you are to the narrator, you get a different ending. Each time you replay and get a different ending, the more rewarding your experience may become. Why I bring up this game is because to tell Stanley's parables, the interactivity a video game allows lets the creator do far more than if they were to just make a film or write a story. Not saying it wouldn't be possible, but the effect would be different. Being told the story and following it doesn't really yield a rewarding experience. Yet finding the broom closet ending is more rewarding, comedically, while finding the apartment ending is more rewarding existentially. Gris, however, does not have these branching paths, or a narrator, or really any text, as opposed to immersing yourself into Stanley, the man who says, fuck the system and fuck the narrator, you are a woman who has to solve puzzles. These puzzles unlock new areas, you progress through the game, and eventually you will beat the game. The game simply isn't difficult. I played through it in one sitting with the intention of actually uploading a video of it to his channel. As credits rolled, though, I struggled to find words to describe the game, instead filling the time with describing what I saw versus actually commenting on the experience. I'm trying to figure out what to say after playing this. I suppose the first thing I guess I should say is this game is really beautiful. I would say that I want this game to be a film. Like, basically take out the cutscenes and whatever and turn that into a film, but I don't know, I feel like even the game itself is a cinematic experience, enough of a cinematic experience where it is a film kind of on its own. Just a very interactive film. The game starts off without any color, while ending with all the colors you unlocked in the game. Only now as I rewatch old footage and record new, higher resolution footage am I able to make more sense of this game. As at the time I first played it, I was still trying to make sense of it, even a week after finishing. Almost a year after first playing this game, Gris has started to make more sense to me. The power of Gris comes from the visual metaphors in the game as juxtaposed to the moments they are used. To get the full impact of the game, I would recommend playing it at night in a dark room, only illuminated by your computer monitor. Over time, your room will go from being illuminated by the stark white at the game's beginning to being dimmed by the darker shades of colors you see later on. It is the absence and presence of color that tells the story of this game. In the beginning, the opening of the game is filled with warm shades of red and yellow, mixed with the cool shades of blue and green. But when you first input anything into the game is where the only colors on screen are Gris's teal hair and rosy cheeks. Everything else is as grayscale as a sketchbook until you get to this crumbled hand. The red bleeds onto the page as if watercolor, now turning the landscape into a mix of black, white, and red. Following this mechanical wasteland for the red part of the game is now this green architecture. What was previously lost ruins is now this turquoise green structure. Yet the environment is also affected by this change in color, as instead of walking through a red desert like you were before, you are now in a redwood forest. The trees complement the terrain as everything above ground radiates from the light of the sun, as everything below ground is a dark, earthy green. Green, blue, then yellow, the final color. At this point, the game is no longer monochrome, and the overall tone of the game has shifted greatly. So why are these colors important? What is the meaning of this metaphor, as there has to be a reason this whole game is about solving puzzles to recapture these four colors. If I say death, do you think of colorful things? If I say life, what colors do you think of? Now, this is what makes death as a topic interesting, is depending on your cultural background, your answer may vary. Simply put, though, America keeps things very depressing. For dead soldiers, it is a moment of silence, not a moment of jubilation, and for the elderly, it is a quiet funeral, where sure, some members of the family will speak, but often the only thing noticeable is the absence of life in everyone. Never have I been to a funeral that was fun, as in, sure, people are grieving, but people outwardly appear to be happy for a life that did exist, that did happen. What I am saying is, never have I been to a funeral where people actually are celebrating that life did happen. It is always about honoring an end. It is always quiet. It feels like there is always a group of people that have to keep it together as another group is unable to. And then when the funeral is over, it is all over. The most life is celebrated afterwards is occasionally visiting the cemetery and leaving flowers on the grave. To celebrate is to honor, which is to be alone, keeping your sorrow to yourself, and ultimately suffering in silence for years. Hell, only once have I done anything more than quietly acknowledge the passing of someone, yet it feels like even having a picnic with the deceased is antithetical to how one is supposed to conduct honoring the dead in America. Yeah, I feel like the game has a second metaphor to it, where while it is clear the story is about grief and death, it also feels like it could be about depression and art. Consider how the character, Gris, loses her ability to sing right in the beginning of the game, and then consider what exactly life is. I think the meaning of life, so as I have decided it for myself and only myself, is to create and leave a legacy. Biologically, most people are going to do this, especially if you eventually have children. But there is another way. If I die tomorrow, the music I have uploaded to Bandcamp will still be there. So will my videos on this channel. There will be an album's worth or so of unfinished songs on my computer. Any unfinished projects, perhaps like this one or perhaps not like this one, will still be on our hard drive. This script's being written on Google Drive, so that, plus all the files on my drive, all my emails, all of it, will still be around. The terabytes of files I have on my computer will still be around. Eventually, everything will dissolve into nothing, but until then, the things I have created will still be around. Consider how there are a lot of dead people's art in the Smithsonian. Consider how there are a lot of dead people's books in libraries and bookstores. Consider how there are a lot of dead people's films on services like Netflix, Criterion, Amazon, the Internet Archive, and so forth. What I'm going to pose now is, when does the artist die? Several people have said the following in different ways. In a long way, Irvin D. Yalom essentially says someday the living memory of him will be gone because everyone who met him while he was alive will be dead. I think the way Banksy repeats this sentiment is more concise and poignant. They say you died twice. One time when you stopped breathing, and a second time, a bit later on, when someone says your name for the last time. These artifacts left by artists, being their own works, are the legacy that artists leave behind, and in reality is the most they are able to leave behind as the body inevitably decomposes and their words fade from memory. Yet, for an artist or a creative type, the goal in life may be to create this legacy and leave a meaningful impact on the world. The only way to do this ends up being through the creative process they love. What if the artist hates what they create? You're expected to do something and consistently do it well, as if being an artist is equal to performing surgery, arguing in front of a court, or repairing a car. It is expected that a surgeon will consistently do their job as good as they have previously, if not better. Same for a lawyer, and same for a car mechanic. After all, you're paying them to do a specific job that they are trained to do. But is this the same for an artist? There isn't a correct answer here. After all, paying a writer to write, paying an illustrator to illustrate, or paying a musician to perform comes with the expectation of the job getting completed. But, really, what happens if the artist does this job and begins to no longer feel a strong sense of attachment like they did before? They're still expected to create something amazing in spite of their heart simply not being there. So it goes, Coda is a game developer who creates ideas in the source engine. A game that people leave notes in, a game with a prison, a game with floating islands, a game with a house, and a game with a stage. Coda creates these games and doesn't really do anything with them. Some aren't that complete, such as one that is basically DE dust, while others are short experiences, sometimes even including dialogue. Some have interesting concepts to them, such as a time slowdown that keeps you from reaching this room, while another has you walking backwards. If I were to critique each of these games individually, I'd probably compare them to some postmodern tropes in postmodern art. In a postmodern interpretation of the meaning of art, at its most reductive form, an artist is an artist because someone likes their creations. I don't have to critique Coda's work because Davey Wreden did that for me in The Beginner's Guide.
Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Wreden. Today, I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and 2011.
Now, before playing this game, I had an idea to tie this game into this video because my understanding of this game before playing it was that it said something about creating video games. What I wasn't expecting was for the game to tie an arm behind my back. You see, the problem I have with explaining this game is that it has created a condition where for me to talk about the game, I become what this game criticizes. Yeah, that is a problem. I understand the message of this game, and the more I think about it, the more I realize the truth in what it is saying. But then I realize that for me to give my thoughts on this game, uncompromised and vocally, means for me to become what the game criticizes. Right now, I am not what the game criticizes, but the moment I talk about drawing meaning from the game based on assumptions I make about the creator, I am doing exactly what happens in the game. Yet, I think what this game's message is does tie in well with the theme of today's video. The last 30 minutes of this game made me think about a lot of different things, pretending to be so confident in something when in reality is a false veil, finding an answer to such fears and reclusivity, lying to yourself and pretending you still maintain a creative drive, becoming a manufacturer and no longer being an artist, in the end, despising what you once loved. On top of that, there's also the general issue of Davey Wreden applying his own assumptions on the meanings of these games, when in reality, they were just games, and were never anything more. Then there's Coda. Coda is either A, beginning to make games no longer for themselves, but for an audience, or B, suddenly being expected to create masterpieces when they never set out to do such a thing. Following this, for as much as Davey Wreden, the character, is off in his assumptions about Coda throughout the whole game, we cannot forget the narrative that is crafted, even if it is crafted on total bullshit. In a way, it is like coming to the right answer by using the wrong methods, and what I argue is there may be something correct in the conclusions drawn by Davey, yet such conclusions are not appropriate for the context they exist in. The long and short of this is that The Beginner's Guide tells a story of an artist who becomes self-destructive, so it seems. The initial story is of an artist who begins to loathe their own creations and eventually creates a game that punishes the player for playing it. They now hate the audience. Yet even though it is revealed that Davey Wreden's narrative on Coda being depressed in life was false, is there not some truth to this? After all, it was Davey, the character, who made Coda hate game development. I've put the character text on screen several times here for a good reason. If you have played the game and did listen to the spoiler warning I flashed on screen, then you would know why. But for those who didn't care and just want to hear me describe The Beginner's Guide, the reason I flashed the character on screen is because it really isn't certain what is real from the story. In reality, what is known is that Davey Wreden is a game developer, specifically behind the mod and official release of the Stanley Parable.
Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Wreden. I wrote the Stanley Parable, and while that game tells a pretty absurd story, today I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and
The Stanley Parable, as covered previously, verges on breaking anyone's preconceptions of video game narrative at the time it came out. So naturally, is it that far-fetched that everything in The Beginner's Guide is total fucking bullshit?
You heartless bastard.
As in, Coda never existed, Davey, the character, is simply a narrator played by himself, and the story created is just the story made by a man who wrote The Stanley Parable? But how much of this is real? There is one idea I want to suggest, specifically my assumption of the game before playing it. Davey is Coda, aka this is Davey's story in game development. The dates line up as Coda's development history ends in 2011, the same year the Stanley Parable source mod was released. Plus, just on the surface level, this does read as a story about someone who begins a bunch of projects that are fairly experimental, but doesn't complete them or get them to a point that is beyond a 30-minute experience. For reference, the original Stanley Parable mod has a fraction of the endings the game has, and on top of that does feel similar to the game shown in the beginner's guide. Thus, I believe this is a game about Davy, created by Davy, and that Coda is simply a representation of Davy before making the Stanley Parable mod. The third possibility is that this actually is 100% true. There was a Coda who made these games that Davy was able to recompile into a new game, did so without their permission or their blessing, and somehow has not gotten sued. This isn't an obscure game, so I imagine it is very difficult for Coda, who would most likely be familiar with new game releases on Steam, to never see or hear about their work being included in a game without their permission. Then it is very unlikely some kind of expose would not occur. How could there not be articles interviewing the real Coda, or just a tweet? Following this, why wouldn't there be some kind of legal challenge? Why is this game still being sold if most of the content in this game was stolen from someone who has the right to file a DMCA takedown request on this infringing work? Therefore, I rule out the possibility of this third scenario entirely, unless Coda is dead or has been silenced by, I don't know, the mob. Simply put, this is either a very well-made narrative by Davy Wreden that similarly gives no insight into his character as a real person, or is a very well-made narrative by Davy Wreden about the artist, Davy Wreden. When does the artist die? It is absurd to conclude that there are 3 deaths to an artist. The final death, as previously discussed, would be the moment that an artist is no longer named, as in their impact on the world is no longer ongoing. The death before that is biological, as the cells in the body of the artist cease to function. I now argue that the first death of an artist is not their biological death, but one that comes before. It may predate the biological death by many years, or by just a couple seconds, but the moment of this death is when the artist pulls their pen away from paper for the last time.